I think reading books is really important. And when I say books, I mean nonfiction books. And so that's why I set myself the goal to read at least 3 nonfiction books per month. Now, sometimes I do fall short on that goal because I am reading something else, for example, research papers or articles, or I'm just too busy. But I at least try to read the equivalent of 3 nonfiction books per month. Now, in this video, we are going to talk about the 2 main reasons why I try to read as much as possible, especially books, even in the age of Google searches that can answer your questions instantly and AIs. So the first reason comes from the book Where Good Ideas Come From by Steven Johnson. And in the book, the author explains that good ideas don't usually come from eureka moment like the one Archimedes had inside his bath. Those stories are usually either apocryphal or extremely rare. Instead, good ideas usually come from slow hunches that are maybe 25% of an idea or 50% of an idea that slowly matures inside your brain and then eventually collides with other slow hunches or ideas that will merge together and create this good idea. So you can think of great ideas or innovative ideas not as just this singular thing, but as this network of smaller ideas or slow hunches that comes together. Now, to do that, you can't really close your eyes and expect ideas to just collide inside your brain. You need to go out and learn about different ideas by either reading or having conversations. But even if you do that, you can't really plan for having a great idea. You can't really just say like, oh, next week I'll have a great idea. This process usually relies on luck, or as the author would call it, serendipity. And so the only way to have more good ideas is to engineer your environment so to have more luck or more serendipitous collisions between ideas. Here's what the author has to say. Quote, like any other thought, a hunch is simply a network of cells firing inside your brain in an organized pattern. But for that hunch to blossom into something more substantial, it has to connect with other ideas. The hunch requires an environment where surprising new connections can be forged. And so, for someone like an academic, they can have a lot of different ideas merging inside their brain because they're teaching, they're having conversations with their colleagues, they're reading a lot, and they're researching. And so, for example, if they read, let's say, 7 books per month, they can take the ideas of the first book and link them to the ideas of the 7th book they read this month. But for average people like you and I, whose job is not to read all day, it's a bit harder. Here's what the author has to say. He says, if it takes you 2 weeks to finish a book, by the time you get to the next book, you've forgotten much of what was so interesting or provocative about the original one. You can immerse yourself in a single author's perspective, but then it's harder to create serendipitous collisions between the ideas of multiple authors. So that's why I try to read as much as possible, because I want as many ideas inside my head to collide so then I can have innovative opinions, innovative ideas, or just more original ideas instead of just repeating what someone else has said. Now, the second reason is a bit related to the first one, where when you buy a book, it's usually because there's some information in there that you want to know more about. For example, I'm currently reading about the 1950s for a future video and about the quality of life of the 1950s compared to the quality of life now. And so I read a lot of articles, and in one of them, they quoted the book The Way We Never Were. And so I decided to read it. But as you can see in the page of contents, there's only one chapter that specifically talks about the American families in the 1950s. And it makes up, out of the 500 pages in that book, only 29 pages. So in the entire book, she probably talks about the 1950s for only 50 pages. So there's 450 pages of information I didn't ask or intend to know more about. But this is not a disadvantage. This is an advantage of books, because those 450 pages allowed me to know the existence of information I would have never Googled otherwise. And this is a very powerful aspect of books. And to illustrate the power of just knowing the mere existence of information, let me tell you a quick story. So recently I was talking to someone about this scene in Inglourious Bastards where instead of doing this to signal 3, he did this, which indicated that he was not German. So when talking about this, I remembered watching a short of a linguist explaining that these types of behaviors have a name, and the name comes from the Bible. But I didn't remember the name he gave for this concept. So what I did is I opened ChatGPT and I typed, what is the name of an action or behavior that differentiates between two groups? And it comes from the Bible. And ChatGPT gave me the answer I was looking for, which is shibboleth, which is a custom or usage regarded as distinguishing one group from others. So just the mere fact of knowing that this information existed allowed me to then use the tools that we have at our disposal now and search it and find it again. So this is the second reason why I try to read as much as possible, especially books, because there's a lot of information in books that I wouldn't have thought of Googling otherwise. Now this, I think, raises a very interesting question. Is it better to focus on memorizing information and truly understanding it and being able to recite it, or is it better to focus on knowing the existence of as much information as possible? Well, philosophers like Socrates would have advocated for the former. He said, only a simple person, he tells Phaedrus, would think that a written account was at all better than knowledge and recollection of the same matters. Far better than a word written in the water of ink is an intelligent word graven in the soul of the learner through spoken discourse. Then 300 years passed, more books were written, and one philosopher called Seneca said this about learning. He said, quote, "Be careful, however, lest this reading of many authors and books of every sort may tend to make you discursive and unsteady. You must linger among a limited number of master thinkers and digest their works if you would derive ideas which shall win firm hold in your mind. Everywhere means nowhere." And so, for these philosophers, I think it made sense to hold these positions because they lived at a different time than we do now, because they didn't have access to Google to quickly search one information and they had to learn it by heart. So I think their opinions, their belief makes sense. But since then, the world has changed dramatically. There's been in the 15th century the printing press that has allowed way more books to be printed. Then 500 years later, there's been the internet and now AI, and now the barrier of entry to produce content is now lower than ever. So if we just take a look at the scientific publications that are published every year, as you can see here in the 1880, it's barely above the zero line. But I think in 2015, there's been 5 million scientific publications in that year. So even if you spent your entire life reading, you wouldn't be able to go through just 1 year of scientific publication. So let's say you read 100 scientific papers a day, 365 for 100 years, you would only be able to read 3.65 million scientific papers in your entire lifetime. And that's just for scientific publications. Now, if you think of YouTube videos, YouTube shorts, TikToks, books, news articles in general, I don't think you could go through in your entire lifetime all of the content that will be produced in the next hours because there's just so much. So we need to have a different strategy. We need to compromise on certain things. So for example, we don't really need to know by heart that the printing press was invented around the 1440 or that Gutenberg was a goldsmith. Instead, just knowing the gist of it and where to find the information is way more important. Same thing for phone numbers. You don't really need to learn by heart phone numbers anymore. You can just delegate this task to your phone. But if you don't want to be beholden to technology, you can always use a mixed strategy. You can always say, okay, I'll just learn by heart the most important phone numbers and the rest I'll delegate it to technology. And it's a similar strategy that I'm using right now to learn things. So to learn, I'm trying to use all of the tools available to me, and I'm using a mixed strategy. So 50% of my time, about that, will be spent to make serendipitous collisions more probable. So I'll spend my time reading anything and everything that interests me. For example, books, YouTube videos, research papers, or just Google things that I think are interesting. But then the other 50% of my time will be spent doing in-depth research. But the great thing about this mixed strategy is that I can use that 50%, the things that I've learned, the things that I now know exists, to guide my in-depth research, because there might be a book that I read 2 years ago that will help me with my research. And then I can use things like Google or ChatGPT to then find this information back, because I at least know its existence. Using this strategy, I'm not demonizing or glorifying any medium of learning. I'm using all the tools with their pros and cons together to get the most efficient way of learning and researching stuff. So what do you think about this? Do you think this strategy for learning is good? And if not, what strategy do you think is best to learn as efficiently as possible? Let me know in the comments down below. Please like and subscribe. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.